Today, I am listing the top 10 greatest death metal albums of all time, according to you guys. So a couple weeks ago, I saw my buddy Farban do a video on the top 10 greatest black metal albums of all time according to his subscribers, and I thought, hey, that's a pretty good idea. I want to do it on death metal. So hey Farban, I'm stealing your idea. So I asked you guys in the community section of this channel, and I also went on Reddit asking people what they thought were the greatest death metal albums of all time. So I had a couple rules to do this. Number one, it has to be a full-length album, no demos or EPs on this list. I know that in death metal, demos can get to be of pretty good quality, but I wanted to get the full-length releases that really mark the genre with their quality. Number two, I count how many mentions a specific album had. So, depending on how many mentions an album had is like votes that will put the album in on the list. Number three, a band can only have one album featured on the list. So a specific band had several albums mentioned more than once, I will count the one that was mentioned the most to be on the list. That way, no one band can dominate the entire list. If I hadn't done this, the list would have mostly been dominated by death. Let's be honest. I didn't count my personal opinion on this to make the list. This is all you guys. So if you don't agree with the albums that are on this list, then take it on with you guys, because it's you, not me. And don't think I forgot to count in some albums to see if they make it on the list. I counted it all. So to start off, on number 10 with 12 mentions, it's Pestilence with Consuming Impulse, released in 1989. This album has surprisingly great quality for the time. When I was revisiting this album, I was genuinely surprised on how good everything sounded. Like, nothing had too much reverb or the guitars weren't overly saturated with gain. This is Pestilence's second album, and just like the previous one, Malleus Maleficarum, it's very much thrash influence, but this is where they started getting those progressive hints that they started working on more and more with their later works, and I think that's what really makes this album special. Honestly, I think it's one of the most enjoyable albums to listen to out of the old school death metal stuff, just because of how good it was produced. And this made me think that the Netherlands is a bit of an overlooked country with how many great bands it actually has, like Sinister and Asphyx and Severe Torture, to name a few. And I was surprised of how much Pestilence was mentioned also with Testimony of the Ancients and Spheres, but at the end, I think it's right that Consuming Impulse was featured on the list. And also it has one of the most iconic death metal covers of all time. Now, in number 9 with 13 mentions, it's Immolation with Close to a Word Below. Released in the year 2000, it might be Immolation's most evil sounding album, and what I read from a lot of people that mentioned this album is that it's probably the only one that could surpass Dawn of Possession in terms of quality. And as I said before, this is an incredibly evil sounding album. Right from the get-go with the song Higher Coward, you get this really dense and dark atmosphere, almost like swarming with flies. I feel like this album is a great representation of Immolation's sound as a whole, both with the earlier albums and with their later albums, where like the more out there composition that really started to be present from Here and After and onwards, with their weird placements of riffs and stuff, but also that like dark grooves that they started to do more and more with each albums, and you can especially hear it in Majesty and Decay. But I think it's in this album that it's done the best, and you can really hear it with the song Father, You're Not a Father. This is a great song to start off a show with how groovy it is, and it's very headbangable, but also has those dark layers beneath that kind of tell you not everything is fun and games. There's a hell looming in the shadows. There's horror behind this. I'm really glad this album was featured on the list. It's just a fantastic album. Personally, my favorite Immolation album is Here and After, but this album is just monstrous. I cannot deny how great this album is. Number 8 is the only spot on this list that had 2 albums, because they were the only ones that were tied up with the exact amount of mentions. And they are 2 very different sounding albums that I thought they both equally deserve a spot on this list. Both with 14 mentions. The first one of them is Bolt Thrower with Realm of Chaos, Slaves to Darkness. From 1989, this might be my favorite Bolt Thrower album. It's the one that is the most outward with the Warhammer 40k theme. And I think this is the only Bolt Thrower album that was tuned to A standard. The previous one was tuned to C standard, and then they tuned to C sharp standard for the rest of their career. And I personally like this album the best out of both Throwers' discography because I think it's the one that focuses the least on the groove that they are known for and has the fastest and the slowest moments on songs of theirs ever. And maybe it's the one that has the most interesting ideas. I knew from the beginning that Bolt Thrower was gonna be featured on this list, and I'm glad it's with this album. The other album that also had 14 mentions is actually Necrophagist with Epitaph, released in 2004. Whether you like it or not, it's probably one of, if not the most important technical death metal album out there because it basically detonated the whole modern technical death metal movement that we have today. And a lot of those modern bands, whether they hear it themselves or not, are very much influenced in some way by this album. And some people might say that Onset of Putrefaction is a better album than Epitaph, but Epitaph is really the one that really made a mark on the genre. And for a lot of people, that one was the song that introduced them to technical death metal. And on number 7, with 15 mentions, is Obituary with Cause of Death, released in 1990. One of the thickest albums of the time. Is probably the only Obituary album that I go out of my way to listen to, and it's got one of the most iconic death metal songs of all time with Chop in Half, of course. It's a really simple, bare bones album, but it's just a lot of fun. At number 6, with 16 mentions, we have Cannibal Corpse with Tomb of the Mutilated. Released in 1992, it becomes 30 years old this September. And this album actually almost didn't make it to the list. The Bleeding was actually very much ahead of it until like the very end. It actually won it over for like 1 or 2 mentions. And you know, we're talking about Cannibal Corpse. The song that probably pops in your head first is, of course, Hammer Smash Face. Also one of the most controversial covers at the time. What else could we say? You know this album was gonna be on this list. I knew it. At number 5, with 21 mentions, is actually Entombed with Left Hand Path. Released in 1990, this album actually almost didn't make it to the list. But like at the very end of me counting mentions, this album just picked up the pace like really hard. Probably the album that detonated the HM2 craze in Sweden in the 90s, and also my first introduction to the Stockholm sound of death metal. And it had a very present punkish energy that really made it differentiate itself from the American style of death metal at the time. Now at number 4, with 23 mentions, it's finally Death. But every Death album got mentioned a bunch of times, like almost every album got mentioned more than 10 times. Symbolic and Human were tied up for the number 2 spot. Spiritual Healing was mentioned a lot. I was surprised of how much love Spiritual Healing was getting. But in the end, the Death album that made it to the list was Leprosy. Released in 1988. In my opinion, is the thickest sounding Death album. And honestly, when someone mentions the words old school death metal, this is the album that I think about first. It has a very iconic cover, it has several iconic death metal songs, timeless songs. And it features one of my favorite death songs, and honestly one of the most iconic death metal songs of all time, Pull the Plug. I love Chuck's vocals on this album, they sound ferocious and kind of tortured. My personal favorite death album is actually Human, but I'm not mad at all that this album made it to the list. Now at number 3, with 26 mentions, is Suffocation with Effigy of the Forgotten. Released in 1991, for a lot of people, this is the birthplace of brutal death metal. This is an absolutely undeniable album. It goes from being really fast and pulverizing with a fair amount of technical prowess to having some of the heaviest sections with their slam breakdowns. It's just an album that influenced a lot of bands and pioneered several different styles. And whether it was this or Pierce from Within, Suffocation had to be on the list. A number 2 with 33 mentions, it's one that actually surprised me that had this amount of love. It's Cryptopsy with None So Vile. Yes! Yes! Released in 1996, it's undeniably one of the most important technical and brutal death metal albums of all time. It's also one of the most important death metal albums for me personally. This album actually made Cryptopsy my favorite band in middle school, and it has just so many ferocious and absolutely demolishing songs from the very start right up until the end, with songs like Crown of Horns, Slit Your Guts, Phobophile, and some very underrated songs like Graves of the Fathers and Death and Dripping. This is an album that I still listen to very often to this day, and really glad it made it this high up on the list. Now before we get to number 1, which you might have already figured out, I want to include some honorable mentions of some albums that just didn't make it to the list, but are worth mentioning. A bunch of albums had exactly 11 mentions, like Incantation with Onwards to Golgotha, Autopsy with Mental Funeral, Gorguts with Obscura, which is one of my favorite death metal albums of all time, Demolik with Nespithe, Deicide with their self-titled album, and also some other albums gathered 10 mentions, which were Deicide with Legion, Carcass with Hard Work and Necroticism, and At the Gates with Stellar of the Soul. But now at number 1 with a whopping 37 mentions, it's Morbid Angel with Altars of Madness. Released in 1989, what a lot of people were saying, and I do agree with them, is that this is one of the most defining death metal albums for the style, especially this early on. This is an album that I've come to love more and more as of recently, and I even made a whole video dedicated to it on its 33rd anniversary. This album really defined what death metal sounds for a lot of people, with the barrages of blast beats and the ferocious guitar riffs, but you can also hear very clearly the thrash metal roots that death metal has, and also some very present, just classic heavy metal influence on it. For me, this is a no skips album, and if we're being objective, it makes sense it was featured this high up on the list. This album influenced just so many bands, and being such an early example of this style, it really helped define the genre as a style of its own. Also, for those of you that like numbers and graphs, here's the pie chart. There you go. But what do you guys think? Do you agree with this list, or will you have included something different? Let me know in the comments down below. And also, I now want you guys to tell me what you think are the greatest death metal bands of all time. Not the albums, just the bands. Because it could have been that one of these bands released one of the most iconic albums of all time, but then the rest of the discography was just kinda meh. So tell me, what are the greatest death metal bands of all time, whether they started on 1990 or in 2003 or whatever? Let me know. If you like this video, please hit that like button down below, and if you're not subscribed, consider subscribing. It's free, and I don't know, I think it will make you pretty cool. And if you already subscribed, please click that bell down below so you never miss a new video. If you really like my videos, you can support me on my Patreon, which is linked down below. Any help I can get goes a long way for me being able to continue making these videos and being able to improve them. All my social media links and my Discord server link will be in the description down below as always, so please go check it out, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Take care.